Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our Civil War and Reconstruction Google Hangout with Professor Eric Foner. To ask questions during this session, please use the QA feature, which will be located in the grid on the upper right-hand corner of your Google Hangout window. If we do not get to your question this evening, please feel free to post your question on the discussion board for the Google Hangout session in our edX MOOC. And without further ado, Eric Foner.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, I'm very happy to be here in this latest Google Hangout, and I will try to answer as many questions as I can in the course of the next hour. So let us begin. First question is from Maureen Prendergast. How active were women during the Civil War? Well, active is a slightly ambiguous or vague term. Women, both North and South, played a major role in various aspects related to the war. In the North, large number, in both, maybe we should start with this. In both societies, the drawing off of hundreds of thousands of men into the military put women in positions, in jobs, in places of authority, which they would not have had and did not have in peacetime. Many women in the North went to work for the federal government in some sort of clerical or other capacity. Women found jobs as nurses, of course. Women in the North organized these sanitary fairs, which were these large fundraising bazaars, basically, which raised money to assist soldiers, wounded soldiers, help medical care and other supplies for soldiers. In the South, again, women were left on farms and plantations with their husbands having been drawn off into the army. They found themselves running these, agricultural enterprises which they had not done before. Again, women were employed by the Confederate government. In other words, like any large war, opportunities open to women that would not have been there in peacetime. The question is what happens after the war? Generally speaking, women went back to their more conventional roles, North and South, but not all. Many of the women teachers and nurses and other professions of the post-Civil War era had gotten their start, both sides, during the Civil War. So it did change the condition of women, but not as much, let us say, as World War II would in the next century. Okay, let's go to the next question here from Cody Wells. What kind of pressures, if any, were on Lincoln to initiate peace negotiations with the Confederacy? Were there any points in which he gave serious consideration to accepting a truce and recognizing the Confederacy? Well, for the last part, no. Lincoln was never, ever willing to recognize the Confederacy under any circumstances. A truce? No, there was really very little discussion of that. The real crux comes in 1864 when there's massive disaffection in the North, or war weariness, you might say, with casualties rising, and the war's now gone on for 3 years. And there is pressure on Lincoln to have a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy, but not exactly to recognize the Confederacy. The pressure, and it's coming from Democrats and some Republicans, is to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. The argument begins getting circulated that it is Lincoln's pledge by this point to end slavery that is making the South continue the fight. If he says, okay, you can come back with slavery, the theory is the South will then accept that. Now, there's no evidence that that is the case, absolutely not. But nonetheless, there was a lot of pressure on Lincoln, including from Republicans who feared that he would not be reelected in the fall because of war weariness in the North. In August 1864, when Lincoln thought he was going to lose the presidential election, a number of Republican leaders, including Henry Raymond, the editor of the New York Times, came to see him and made this proposal. And Lincoln seems to have thought about it overnight, basically. He didn't just kick him out. He said he thought about it. But the next day, Frederick Douglass then visited him in the White House, and he told Douglass, no, I cannot do this. He said, if I were to promise people freedom and then rescind the promise, I would be damned in time and eternity. Quite a phrase. I'd be damned in time and time and eternity. So nothing came of that peace pressure to have a truce or to change the nature of the war. Lincoln did have his negotiations in February 1865, the so-called Hampton Roads Conference with a couple of Confederate leaders. Lincoln and Seward went down there. By that time, the Confederate defeat was pretty much, obvious and inevitable. And basically, Lincoln was just talking about how they should surrender and what would happen when they surrendered. It was not a negotiation about a truce. It was not a negotiation about recognize the Confederacy. He said, again, if you stop the war and you recognize the end of slavery, and recognize the authority of the U.S. government, well, then the war will be over. But that just means surrender, so they wouldn't do it. What was Lincoln's opinion of how the Founding Fathers dealt with slavery? It's an interesting question. There was a book published a couple of years ago by Richard Brookhiser called Founder's Son, or something like that, about Lincoln, trying to talk about his assumed connection to the Founding Fathers. Lincoln always insisted in the 1850s that his policy of stopping the westward expansion of slavery was the Founding Fathers' policy. He was a conservative. He was simply putting into effect the purposes of the Constitutional Convention, which, according to Lincoln, put slavery on the road to ultimate extinction. That the founders wanted to stop slavery from expanding. He pointed to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which prohibited slavery from going into the old Northwest, although it allowed it to go into the Southwest. He didn't mention that. He said the word slave is not mentioned in the Constitution, which is true until the 13th Amendment after the war. They talk about other persons held to labor, that kind of thing. So Lincoln made the case that the founders had basically set out this policy for the gradual disappearance of slavery. Now, this is, of course, how shall we put it, not 100% persuasive. Slavery is in the Constitution, even though the word slavery is not in the Constitution. In his Lyceum speech of 1837 or 8, one of his first major public speeches, Lincoln, a young man at that point, Lincoln said something to the effect that, what is left for our generation to do? The founders have sort of created this nation, have, had this great achievement of revolution, constitution. What could we do to outstrip them? And he mused and he said, there's really nothing we can do, which is an odd thing for a very ambitious man to say. I can't do anything that'll put me up on the level of the founders. But he then said, maybe some dictator will come along, seeking glory, seeking to be like the founders. And one of the ways to do that is freeing slaves or enslaving free men. Freeing slaves will enable you to rise to the level or even outdo the founders. That doesn't mean Lincoln was ready to free slaves in 1838, but that in a sense, he's saying that is the issue the founders left to us. They didn't solve it. Even though he goes on to say later on, well, they had this plan. They didn't solve it. They left it to our generation. You could see that as a criticism of the founders if you wanted to. Okay, Jessica. This is from on the discussion forum. Yeah, right. Do you have any recommendations for movies, films, novels that do justice to historical accuracy as they bring stories of the Civil War era to life? Accuracy is not really the question here. Works of fiction, movies, novels, works of historical fiction are not accurate. The question is, are they plausible, so to speak? All the dialogue is made up, the characters are made up, et cetera, although they may be real historical characters also. I'm not a big fan of Hollywood history, I have to say. I think most of the time it's more misleading than plausible. I don't want to go into a diatribe about the movie Lincoln. or other movies. There's a lot wrong with them, let's just put it that way, as history. Now, there were movies like 12 Years a Slave, which is based on the autobiography of a man who was kidnapped into slavery, and it's a very dramatic and visceral picture of slavery. In the fall, this new movie, Birth of a Nation, borrowing the title of a totally racist movie 100 years ago, is coming out about Nat Turner's rebellion. We'll see what that's like. There are many novels set in the Civil War era. One of them that I think is very good. Well, there are a couple that I think are very good. What is the one now? Now I'm trying to get the name of the title escapes me. Cold Mountain. Cold Mountain. They actually made a movie of that too, which is about Western North Carolina in the Civil War, and it gives you a good sense of the internal conflict within the Confederacy between Unionists and pro-Confederates in this backcountry area, which didn't have very much slavery, but was riven by this internal Civil War. It's not accurate as a historical work is, but it does give you a pretty good sense of what was going on in areas like that during the Civil War. So I'm not against going to those movies, have a nice time, eat some popcorn. I'm not against reading the novels, but if you want to learn about the Civil War, pick up a history book or two. I have heard, says Dyson, that the Gatling gun was used during the Civil War and that it had been used before the war by other countries too. Is that true? Well, the Gatling gun, it's sort of an early machine gun, right? There were experiments like that during the war with rapidly repeating guns. I don't know how, I don't think it got too far. There may have been these early versions used here and there. It was not widely used at all. Whether it was used before the war, when would that be? Maybe the Crimean War in the 1850s. I can't imagine any other war before the Civil War, where an actual Gatling gun would be used. That was too technologically advanced. But the main point is, though, that the technology of warfare advanced very rapidly in the Civil War. I've talked about this in the lectures. You had, armored ships for the first time. You had, the most very great advances in rifles and the accuracy of rifles and bullets during the Civil War. You had observation balloons. You had primitive submarines. You had the use of the telegraph to communicate and the railroad to move troops and supplies very quickly. Much more advanced cannons than had existed. So the war was a tremendous impetus, for better or worse, to the technology of killing people. The Gatling gun probably wasn't a major feature of the Civil War, but there were little experiments along those lines that we used. What kind of impact has Sherman's total war had on the U.S. and succeeding wars, says Miss Folks, Sarah? That's an interesting debate. There was a book published long ago whose author escapes me, called Sherman's March on Vietnam, trying to link Sherman's concept of total war with American tactics or activities in the Vietnam War, particularly the erasure of the line between civilian and military targets. Now, Sherman's total war was not 20th century total war. Sherman was destroying property. On the march to the sea from Atlanta to Georgia to Savannah, they burned a heck of a lot of stuff. They destroyed homes. They destroyed crops. Sherman gave orders not to touch civilians. Some were assaulted, no question about it. But this was not like dropping an atomic bomb, which you're killing hundreds of, tens of thousands of civilians. It's not like the firebombing of Dresden, where their civilians are the target. But nonetheless, it did erase the distinction between military target and civilian target, because as Sherman said in explaining this, his aim was to get at the morale of the South. I want to make them fear us, he said. I want to make them realize they can never win the war, and then they will stop fighting. My aim is to so traumatize Southern public opinion that they will just stop the war. They will realize they can never win. So to do that, you've got to do things which harm civilians. There are those who say that right after the war, the U.S. Army did much the same thing out in the West in the Indian Wars. The destruction of the buffalo. The buffalo was, these Plains Indians lived off these millions and millions of buffalo out there. They ate them. They took their hides for teepees and things. The destruction of the buffalo was not because people didn't like buffalo. It was because they were trying to cut off the supply of food for these Native American tribes that they were trying to move off their land. Is that similar to Sherman's total war? Yeah, probably it is. Total war in the 20th century is used by everybody in some form, so we can't really blame Sherman for it. The Germans, the British, the French, the Russians, you name them, Chinese, Japanese. So unfortunately, in the 20th century, and to some extent, certainly in the 21st, the line between civilian and military is pretty much erased in combat, unfortunately. And Sherman had something to do with that, but it's not totally his responsibility. This is from Catherine Ellington. There were, I guess, as many blacks in Charleston and New York City in the 19th century. How does the seaport shape the Civil War? I'm sure there were more blacks in Charleston than New York City, if you count slave and free. And there were about 11,000 free black people in New York City on the eve of the Civil War. I don't actually know what we could look it up, but the black population of Charleston was, but if you include slave and free, I would think it was more than 11,000. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm wrong. But, seaports play a very important role. I mean, after all, most commerce is going on by ship at that time. Seaports are the site of important black communities, both in the North and the South, whether it's New Orleans or Charleston, as you say, or New York or New Bedford or places like that in the North. So I don't know. I mean, the war doesn't take place at sea mostly. There are naval battles, of course, but most of the war is taking place on land. So it's unclear how the seaport shapes the outcome of the Civil War. But certainly in terms of commerce, the blockade of southern seaports is the first thing Lincoln does to try to, have a military effort against the South. That dealing with seaports and commerce is something that they did try to do in the way the war was being fought. Was any thought given, Stan, thank you, was there any thought given to the impact of the emancipation issue on Native Americans? It's interesting. There is now more attention being devoted by historians to the Civil War in the West and to Native Americans during the Civil War than we have done in the past very much. Some of these Native tribes owned slaves, they did, out in Oklahoma, where the southern tribes have been moved, the Cherokee, the Creek, etc. Several of them sided with the Confederacy and owned slaves. So emancipation was something that would affect them. And indeed, when the war ended, the federal government forced the Indian nations to abolish slavery. And unlike southern slave owners, the natives were required to give land to their emancipated slaves. That didn't happen in the South, of course. We'll get to that down the road in Reconstruction. But of course, also in the Civil War, the war against the Indians was also going on at the same time. There were Indian massacres like the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado during the Civil War, the attack on the Navajo to try to move them to a reservation during the Civil War. And then after the war, these Union generals, Sheridan, Sherman, and the others were out there fighting the Indians. So the natives suffered from the Civil War and suffered from the result of the Civil War, which exalted the power of the federal government and made it all the more difficult for natives to resist being removed from their land and being put off into reservations, which is what happens in the next 25 years after the Civil War. Okay, let's see. We see Lincoln, this is Paul, thank you. We saw Lincoln use war powers as a rationale to emancipate the slaves. He also made comments earlier supporting colonization. Why didn't Lincoln use war power rationale to colonize the slaves and not compensate the owners? Interesting question. Here's the point. Colonization, which is a belief that people are surprised to hear that Lincoln held, but he did. He promoted colonization. That is the removal of the black population to Africa or Central America or somewhere else for at least 10 years, from 1852 to the end of 1862. Then he dropped it with the Emancipation Proclamation. But here's the thing. Colonization was part of a plan to get rid of slavery. It included compensation to the owners, monetary compensation, gradual emancipation, and colonizing the freed slaves out of the country. What was the purpose of this plan? It was to get slave owners to agree to emancipation. Before the Civil War, there was no way slavery was going to be abolished without the consent of the owners. Congress couldn't abolish slavery. Illinois couldn't abolish slavery in Mississippi. It required state action to abolish slavery. Now, the North had done that. New York had abolished slavery, New Jersey, et cetera. It took them a while in New Jersey, but you needed, therefore, to get the cooperation of the owners, and colonization was part of this multi-pronged plan to get their cooperation. Now, when you issue the Emancipation Proclamation, forget about that plan. You don't need the cooperation anymore. This is a new plan. We're not interested in what the slave owners think anymore. We don't care if they are agreeing or not. This is a military measure, and it's going to happen, whatever they think. So you don't need compensation, you don't need colonization, and you don't need gradualism. It's immediate. It's a new way of abolishing slavery. So forget about colonization. It's the old plan. We got a new plan now. So that's why he drops all these things, because he's got a new direction of policy and a new way of implementing. It's no longer state law, it's military action that is going to abolish slavery. Okay, Cody, do you think Lincoln gave much consideration to the precedents he was setting, such as suspending habeas corpus or initiating the draft? Or was he mostly focused on short-term? No, Lincoln was thinking about the Civil War. I don't think he sat there and said, what is going to happen if a bunch of terrorists blow up the World Trade Center and the president basically suspends the writ of habeas corpus for a lot of people, mostly Muslims, and claims he can arrest anyone he wants and throw him in jail in Guantanamo and throw away the key? No, Lincoln didn't anticipate that. But Lincoln is a lawyer, he's thinking about winning the war. That's what's on his mind. But he is a lawyer. He's a student of the Constitution. He must have known that these actions would reverberate in the future, that this could be a precedent in circumstances, of course, he could not imagine. He could not imagine in World War I. He couldn't imagine World War I to begin with, and he probably couldn't imagine that Congress and the president would abolish freedom of speech during World War I with the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, that hundreds, if not thousands of people would be thrown in jail for criticizing the war effort. No, the scale of the repression in World War I was infinitely greater than what happened during the Civil War. But nonetheless, yes, Lincoln, if he didn't think about it, he should have thought about it, because everything a president does sets a precedent for future presidents. There was a very good scholar, law professor, Professor Stone, Jeffrey Stone, over at Chicago Law School, University of Chicago, who wrote a book a few years ago, I reviewed it somewhere, on Lincoln and Bush and wartime presidents, George W. Bush, Lincoln and Bush, habeas corpus, jailing people, etc. The pressure that war puts on civil liberties. This is an old story. It was a very well done book. He's a great scholar. But at the end, he kind of punted, I felt. He said, what Lincoln did was okay, but what Bush did was not okay. Why? Basically, he likes Lincoln, doesn't like Bush. So he thought what Lincoln anybody. But Jefferson Davis didn't know how to delegate authority. He did not know that the president should deal with important questions and leave trivial questions to subordinates. Having been Secretary of War in the 1850s, he thought of himself as a guy who knew a lot about the military. So he kept trying to micromanage things. Now, Lee was not going to let Davis determine his military strategy. But there was tension between them, no question about it. There was tension later on when Lee, toward the end of the war, said, we got to enlist black soldiers. We don't have any more men here. And the North is having black soldiers. You got to put black men in the Union Army, Davis. I'm sorry. I mean, in the Confederate Army. I'm sorry. I know that is against the principle of slavery, but if you want to win this war, we got to do it. And Davis dragged his heels, couldn't get around. Finally, at the very, very end of the war, they made steps in that direction. But so, most of the time Lee was on his own, but Davis did micromanage things when he could, which was annoying to Lee, certainly. Okay, let's see what's the next one from Erica. How were rural versus urban people in the North or the South getting information? How were the two governments communicating with their public? What were the challenges? Well, very good question. I mean, yeah, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have televised press conferences. No one was sending out tweets from the White House. But actually, people were well informed. First of all, both armies, people were sending letters home all the time. There are thousands upon thousands of collections of Civil War soldiers' letters. More in the North because there were more Northerners serving. But so people at the home front, maybe not the next day, but pretty quickly got a good sense of how their loved ones were feeling, thinking, were they all revved up or were they depressed or what was going on? Then there were newspapers, countless newspapers, far more newspapers than there are today. I mean, in New York City, where I live, what do we have today? 3 newspapers, the Post, the Times, and the News. There must have been 20 or 30 newspapers being published daily in New York City back then, including in German language and other foreign language kind of newspapers. And, thanks to the telegraph, news traveled instantaneously. The newspaper would report on battles the next day. They would report on political developments the next day, and they had vast circulations. In the South, again, there were fewer newspapers, and eventually paper actually began to run out in the South, one of their shortages. But even there, governments used newspapers to communicate. Lincoln issued public letters. He didn't give very many speeches outside of Washington. Yes, he went to Gettysburg, he went to Baltimore once, but he issued these public letters, which he knew would be picked up and reprinted in all the newspapers. So despite the technology, which is not what we have today, people were very well informed. In fact, they probably were better informed than people are today because there were far fewer distractions. They weren't spending their time on dating apps and things, So, so they actually were paying a lot of attention to what was being said and written about the war and politics, etc. All right, from Dyson. The Union used its ironclads to blockade Confederate ports. Yes, well, not really, but did the Union ever use their gunboats for bombardment of a Confederate position? Certainly. No, there were not that many ironclads during the war. There was the famous Merrimack, Monitor and Merrimack, and there are a few others, but most of the ships were wooden ships, and the blockade was mostly, these ironclads weren't all that navigable. I mean, they didn't get around very easily. They were hard to steer. They were very new and a little bit awkward, So most of the blockading was done by regular old wooden ships. But yes, they did bombard Confederate positions. They bombarded Charleston Harbor. They bombarded Fort Wagner. I don't know if you ever saw years and years ago the movie Glory about which is actually not a bad movie. Someone asked about that. Not accurate, but a good movie about black soldiers in the Civil War, the 54th Massachusetts. And they led this assault, which was disastrous, on Fort Wagner near Charleston. Before the assault, Union gunboats bombarded the fort to Kingdom Come. Didn't do any damage, really, unfortunately. But yes, they used gunboats. Later on, Fort Fisher, North Carolina. So yes, they did use ships to bombard Confederate positions right on the coast. No question about it. Thomas, how has your understanding of the Civil War evolved over the course of your career? That's a good question. My career began a long, long time ago. I taught my first course in 1969, the same year I got my PhD degree. That's almost 50 years, 45 years or so. Of course, a vast literature has appeared on every aspect of the Civil War since then. So my understanding of the war has evolved with my own research, but mostly with the work of dozens and dozens of excellent scholars. I think today I and others pay more attention than we did back then to what you might call the social and political history of the Civil War. Not that the military history is not important, but I think there's more focus on what's happening with all these different groups in these two societies, women and their experience in the war, African Americans and their experience in the war, immigrants and their experience in the war. How did the war affect Northern society, Southern society, internal conflicts? All those things are given much more attention now than they would have. My view of Lincoln has changed, actually, dramatically. When I started teaching, I was maybe more critical of Lincoln than I am today. At that point, you know, coming in the late 1960s and the aftermath right away of the Civil Rights Revolution, Lincoln seemed like a kind of slow and not very committed guy. You know, he wasn't like an abolitionist. Why did he wait so long to issue the Emancipation Proclamation? And then there were these racist things he said early in his career. I wrote a book on Lincoln, which was published, you know, a few years ago, The Fiery Trial, and I think it's more favorable to Lincoln. I try to trace his evolution over time toward what I consider a more humane position, toward abandoning some of his earlier prejudices, take into account all the pressures on him from every group, radical, conservative, etc. I don't think the role of the historian is to say, hey, I'm for Lincoln or I'm not for Lincoln. When my book was published, if somebody I know in the Lincoln business, which is a giant industry, said to me, you know, I really like your book because now you're on Lincoln's side. And I said, I didn't say anything much, but I said, no, I'm not on Lincoln's side or against Lincoln's side. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not trying to judge Lincoln good, Lincoln bad. I'm trying to explain as best I can what Lincoln was thinking, what Lincoln was doing, why, how his ideas evolved. Yeah, there are some points at which I'm very critical of Lincoln, and some points I praise him, but I'm not trying to be on his side or not on his side. That's one of the problems with all the literature on Lincoln. People think they either have to put him up on a pedestal, he's the great emancipator, or smash him to smithereens. When you put someone up on a pedestal, someone is going to come along and try to smash him down. And no, he was just a racist colonist, you know, and those views are equally, he was not perfect and he was not totally imperfect either, you know, and you have to find, he's a human being and you have to find the strengths and flaws of him as a human being. So I think I'm more sophisticated nowadays in doing that than I was when I first started teaching. Yeah, okay. Let's see. Hey, Heron, okay. Comment to phone Erica's question about citizens. Yeah, information. I would add, yeah, good point. I would add that the use of the new invention of photography had a tremendous impact. Yes. Oliver Wendell Holmes, young Oliver Wendell Holmes, later Supreme Court Justice, said in the Civil War, the camera has brought the bodies and dropped them at our doorstep. Before that, nobody at home saw what the aftermath of a battle was, right? You had to be there to see it. Now, photography was not sufficient to take a picture during a battle. For that, they had engravers, you know, Harper's Weekly and all these. You'd have guys there drawing, and then it would be engraved, and the next week it would come out in Harper's Weekly or Leslie's. Often, a little bit exaggerated or fanciful, But as soon as the battle ended, these cameramen raced into the field, set themselves up, took pictures of the dead bodies lying there. Pretty shocking, honestly, bringing the horrors of war home, as the question says. And those were published, and those were circulated, and there were exhibits. People like Brady and others, they made money exhibiting in major cities these photographs, and they circulate Gardner all over the place. So yes, it's a good addition to my comment. The photograph brought the war home to people in a very, very new way. This is Bren, could you please briefly address the validity of claims that blacks willingly fought on the Confederate side? Yeah, oh God, yeah. I'm going to give you a quote from Abraham Lincoln. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. If you go on the internet, you will find a website or more devoted to the legions of black soldiers who fought for the Confederacy. This is a myth. I'm sorry, it's a myth. Were there a few black guys who passed for white and joined up with the Confederate Army? Yeah, there are crazy people in every group of human beings. There were free blacks in New Orleans, particularly, who volunteered their services at the beginning of the war. Then when the Union Army came in 1862, they said, oh, we were forced to do that. We want to be with the Union Army. I don't know, maybe they didn't. At the very, very end of the war, like March 1865, as I was mentioning before, the Confederate government did enact a law to raise black soldiers. They grabbed a bunch of black people who were working in hospitals in Richmond, formed them into a company, and sent them down to Petersburg, where the lines were then. Now, did those guys volunteer, or were they just dragged off? I don't know. But you're talking about a handful of people, basically. I mean, it is not the case that large numbers of black people fought for the Confederacy. I'm sorry. Why should they? The Confederacy was fighting to keep them in slavery. But, this myth is out there, and it's very hard to dispel a myth once it has entrenched itself in the internet. Okay, this is from Paul. Considering the controversy surrounding Confederate symbols, yes, and the Northern myth, the war was noble effort to free the slaves versus Southern myth, states' rights, how do you think these affect the public's understanding of the Civil War? Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of myths out there, and people hold to them in one way or another. I think the role of slavery in the war is now more widely accepted than it was, let's say, 25 years ago. This does not mean every Northerner was out to free the slaves, far from it. But as Lincoln said, go look at Lincoln's second inaugural address, March 4th, 1865, where he says, basically, let us get serious here, folks. I'm paraphrasing Lincoln there. Let us get serious here, folks. Everybody knows that slavery was the cause of this war. Everybody did know that in 1865. They don't all know it anymore. In fact, our federal government, if you read the newspapers, which are full of denunciations of universities for numerous reasons, the triumph of postmodern gobbledygook, our federal government is postmodern. People don't realize that. They don't believe in absolute truth. They believe truth is all relative. How do I know that? On the citizenship test that people take, if they want to become naturalized citizens, there is a question, what was the cause of the Civil War? And there are two possible correct answers. One, slavery. Two, states' rights. So the federal government does not believe there is actual truth. So don't complain when universities teach that. But the fact is, yes, states' rights was a cause of the Civil War. Why? Because, as I mentioned before, slavery was created by state law. Not federal law, state law. State law created slavery. State law would be needed to abolish slavery, unless the military did it. Eventually, of course, legally it's abolished by a constitutional amendment, which overrides the states. But so therefore, defending states' rights is the first line of defense of slavery. The right of the states to manage their own internal affairs. However, if you think the South believed in states' rights, just explain to me the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which was pushed by the South, which was the strongest intervention of the federal government in the states of any law in the whole history of the United States up to that point. It invalidated numerous laws of the North about fugitive slaves. It authorized the use of federal marshals and even the army to come into states to grab fugitive slaves. That's not states' rights. That's the opposite of states' rights. That's a vigorous federal action to override the states in the interest of slavery. If you can explain how the South juxtaposed states' rights and the fugitive slave law, then I'll say, okay, they believed in states' rights. But my position is they believed in slavery. When states' rights was a bulwark of slavery, they believed in states' rights. When radical federal action was needed to protect slavery, they were for that also. Constitutional principle was not what was at stake here. It was the security of slavery. Now, I am not crazy enough to believe that all people in the public have read all the recent scholarship on the Civil War and are all up to date on this. This is why I and many, many other colleagues of mine like to give lectures in public forums outside of the university, do an online course, write op-ed pieces in newspapers, because I do feel we scholars have an obligation to present up-to-date history in a readable, lucid manner so that people interested in history, of which there are many, can get the benefit of the most recent thinking along these lines. Jose Diaz, I wonder if the Civil War did not happen, how might America have ended the slave trade? Well, no, the slave trade was already ended. If you mean the slave trade from Africa, there was an internal slave trade among the states. That was still going on. I also wonder how long it would have taken, in hindsight, was the Civil War the only way to end slavery? This is what we call counterfactual history. I don't know the answer to that. Let me put it this way. In the end of 1861, Abraham Lincoln, well, first of all, for 50 years, Lincoln's political idol, Henry Clay, had been pushing for emancipation in Kentucky, a slave state, but not part of the Deep South, okay? 50 years, 1799 to 1849. And he was the one who came up with this plan of colonization, compensation, gradualism to get Kentucky to agree. What happened in Kentucky? Nothing. Nobody gave Clay. He's the leading politician of that state. They just gave him the back of their hand. In the end of 1861, Lincoln called in the congressman from Delaware and some leaders. There were 1,800 slaves in Delaware. Lincoln said, look, we got to get emancipation going. Delaware's in the Union. It hasn't seceded. Here's the plan. It's the same plan as Clay. Gradual compensation, colonization, 1,800 slaves. Delaware can be the leader of this move. What did Delaware say to Lincoln? Forget it, Lincoln. We're not interested. We want our slaves. We are slave owners. We don't care about your money. We want our slaves. We only have 1,800 of them, but we're keeping them. Get out of here. You show me a slave state, after the northern states did this, that is willing to, if Delaware won't peacefully abolish slavery, and by the way, Lincoln said it can go till 1900. You've got a 35-year period here. If Delaware with 1,800 slaves is not willing to do it, you show me Mississippi, Louisiana, the Cotton Kingdom. You think they're going to get rid of slavery voluntarily? Forget it. I have never seen a plausible road to peaceful emancipation in this country. I hate war. I think it's a horrible thing. It's a total waste of human life and resources. I'm not glorifying war, but I have never seen a peaceful road to getting rid of slavery in this country. Would slavery still exist today? No, probably not. Some economists have studied this and said, well, during the Great Depression, the price of cotton fell so low that it would have been completely uneconomical to keep slavery. Okay, maybe that's true. That's 70 years later. Okay, so are you willing to say we should have had 70 years more of slavery? How many millions of people are we talking about? The Civil War cost maybe 750,000 lives, but you want slavery to exist until peacefully abolished in the 1930s. You're talking about maybe 10 million. I don't know how many people living and dying as slaves in that period. So you have to balance off what you think the pros and cons of such a situation are. Okay. Did Mexico give any support to the Confederacy? If so, what was the Union's response? Did the Confederacy try to get support from Central South? Well, an interesting set of questions. You know, the French got in there into Mexico during the Mexico didn't give any support to the Confederacy. Mexico was basically taken over by the French, and Maximilian, this French guy, came over to run Mexico for a couple of years of the Civil War. They had their own internal civil war going on, or political strife. So I don't think Mexico was particularly engaged with the American Civil War. Now, what about South America or Central America? You know, the Confederates, the leaders of secession, had a vision of the future as an independent nation. And that vision was that they would be the kind of hub of a Caribbean slave empire. They would take over Cuba, maybe some of the other islands of the Caribbean. They would take over maybe all of Mexico, certainly Central America, Nicaragua. They would spread slavery down there, El Salvador. They had this idea of a Caribbean slave empire, which they would be the leading force in. Remember, in 1855, I guess it was, William Walker had led what they call a filibustering expedition, an illegal invasion of Nicaragua, and set himself up as president of Nicaragua and reestablished slavery there, which had been abolished, until the Nicaraguans kind of got rid of him and executed him. Now, I guess he wasn't executed because he was put on trial. They kicked him out. He was put on trial in New Orleans because he violated American law by invading another country from the United States, but he was acquitted. Southerners didn't mind the idea of spreading slavery around the Caribbean. So therefore, the existing governments in Central America were not exactly likely to sympathize with the Confederacy, knowing the Confederacy's long-term aims for Central America. Jessica, at what point during the Civil War did yellow fever appear? I don't know the answer to that. You know, I could fudge this, but I'm going to give you an honest answer. I do not know the answer. There were yellow fever epidemics from time to time in the 19th century, particularly in the really deep South, New Orleans area, places like that. But I think I must pass on this one. This is a piece of the Civil War history I do not know. Who were the key planters who had power and influence? You know, every Southern political leader was a key planter, except for a few, like Andrew Johnson, who stays with the Union, Joe Brown, maybe, Governor Georgia, who represents the upcountry. Jefferson Davis, you can start with him. He's a big planter. He had tremendous plantations with his brother, Joseph Davis, on Davis Bend on the Mississippi River. Go down, Howell Cobb, cabinet member of the Confederacy, giant, one of the big, 500 slaves, giant planter. Most of the Confederate cabinet were big slave owners. Most of the governors were big slave owners. I mean, that was how you got ahead in the South, by being a big planter. And the planters, although a small minority, even of slave owners, were the dominant political class in the South. And so, you know, you can just run down any prominent Confederate and you're likely to find a Southern slave owning planter. Would cameramen ever go to the battlefield and take pictures while the battle was going on? No, I said before, first of all, it'd be a little dangerous. And second of all, you had to have a still shot. You couldn't capture motion. Photography couldn't capture motion. That's why these early daguerreotypes you see from the 1840s the people look totally stiff and uncomfortable because you have to sit there for about 5 minutes without moving. Emerson, who saw one of these photographs of him, Ralph Waldo Emerson, said, I look like a corpse here. This is terrible. But that's because that's how you had to take photographs. You couldn't take a photograph of the battle. The technology was not sufficient. So once you got into the field, there was all these dead bodies. They're not going anywhere. So you could take pictures of the dead in the field, Antietam, Gettysburg, these famous Spotsylvania, these famous photographs of people. Then they also took photographs of army camps, of people sitting around writing letters, or generals sitting around. They took pictures of scenes, but again, people had to stay still while the picture was being taken. I'm struggling from Fishheim B. I'm struggling to understand Lincoln's rationale for appointing McClellan to head his most important army, the Army of the Potomac. Why not appoint a qualified Republican leading general? Interesting question. He was not a Republican. He was not anti-slavery, but McClellan was first of all, there weren't all that many qualified generals around. The regular army was very small. A large number of the West Point graduates went back to the South, were Southerners, like Robert E. Lee. There were generals who come out of West Point, but McClellan was an engineer. McClellan was an organizer. He was not a very good general, but he was a brilliant organizer. And Lincoln must have realized this is a guy who can create an army. It's not a point of commanding the army. The Army of the Potomac did not exist. Now, suddenly, tens of thousands of men are under arms. The army goes up to 100,000 men, let's say. 100,000 men sitting around is not an army. It's a mob. You have 50,000 men at Yankee Stadium, let's say. That's not an army. You're going to send them into battle? They wouldn't have the vaguest idea what to do. McClellan spent the first several months just training these guys, making them march up and down and know which way a rifle, which is up and down, a rifle and that kind of thing. And he did a very good job. He did such a good job that neither he nor his successors was able to destroy the army, even though they seem to have done their best with their terrible military tactics. Now, Lincoln wanted to win the war. He didn't care what general did it. In fact, when which general was somebody was talking to him about Burnside, I think, or maybe it was Burnside, one of them anyway, saying, he wants to become a dictator. If he wins battle. Lincoln said, let him win the battles, and then we'll worry about whether he's a dictator or not. My aim is to win the damn battles. Don't worry about whether he's a dictator. The problem with McClellan was he didn't want to fight, which is a very humane attitude. He didn't want to have casualties. He thought if he maneuvered his army into a position of strength, Lee would realize he could never defeat this giant army and surrender. Didn't happen. And also he thought the war should end as a negotiation between the armies. He didn't respect the superiority of the civilian over the military. So Lincoln appointed a bunch of bozos as generals of the Army of the Potomac. One after another, they failed. You got to put some blame on Lincoln for that, no question about it. But none of these guys had been trained at West Point to command an army of 100,000 untrained men. They believed in small professional armies, moving quickly, striking fast. That's not the Civil War. So the guy who was the greatest general was Grant, who had been in the Mexican War, but then wanted to quit. He did quit the army. He wasn't an army man in the traditional West Point mold, even though he'd gone to West Point. He understood the war a lot better from outside the army than a lot of these career officers did from inside it. Did not John Brown predict that only a war would eradicate slavery? Yes, John Brown, his last letter, supposedly, right before he was executed in December 1859, he wrote, I'm not giving the exact words here, but he wrote basically, I, John Brown, am more convinced than ever that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Blood. Only violence, whether war, slave insurrection, something would get rid of slavery, said John Brown. Some people think John Brown was crazy. He may have been crazy, but he certainly had a pretty deep insight there. He was right about that, unfortunately. All right. What was the value of slavery to the GDP, the gross domestic product of the South, prior to the beginning of the war? What was the value of slavery? That was it, man. Slavery was the GDP. If you count in the cotton, the crops grown by slaves, slavery was the slaves themselves were the most valuable thing in the American economy altogether in 1860. You want to know why they're not willing to get rid of slavery? Slaves were human beings, but they're also property. According to the census of 1860, the 4 million slaves as property, they were worth about an average of about $1,000 each in money back then. That was a lot of money, $1,000. They were worth $3.8 billion. That's 1860 billion, not today. Today, billion, forget it. That's a screwdriver in the Pentagon. 3.8 billion was a heck of a lot of money. You want to know how much? All the banks, railroads, and factories in the country, their value added up to 3.4 billion. In other words, the slaves themselves were worth more than all the banks, railroads, and factories in the country. And that doesn't include the cotton, which was by far the most valuable commodity produced in the United States. It was the most important export of the United States. And it was the source of wealth. The richest people in the South, in the country, were the rich Southern slave owners. So the economic entrenchment of slavery was immense. You know, that you just can't. That's why Senator Hammond, South Carolina, said in the Senate in 1858, talking about possible secession, he said, "No power on earth dares to make war on cotton. Cotton is king. King Cotton." That gave them the confidence to secede. They knew they didn't have as many men as the North. They knew they could count. They knew they didn't have the industry of the North, but they had cotton, King Cotton. They thought that nobody could make war on cotton. It would disrupt the entire world economy. The British would have to intervene to prevent the disruption of the cotton trade, which their industry depended on. Slavery was very important economically. All right, we are at the point almost of being finished. So I want to thank you all for posting these questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I commend you for taking this course and hope you enjoy the next few weeks. And then the third version, the third course on the Reconstruction era, which will be launching in early April. So, and I see they're putting up my little interview in the Washington Post there, eh? So, yeah, you can read that and see what the Washington Post wants to know about politics then and politics now. Good evening.